So welcome everybody to today's De-ICE-olation online Inuit Artist Workshop presented by Inuit Futures in Arts Leadership and in collaboration with the Inuit Art Foundation. My name is Daniela May Miles. I'm the research and admin coordinator for the Inuit Futures in Arts Leadership Project. And I'm very excited to be hosting this workshop today, Making Comics with Napatsi Folger, our own Inuit Futures in Inuit, who you will also be seeing in this space in the coming weeks, as she'll be hosting a few of the other workshops that we have lined up. So we're really excited about that. And thank you, Napatsi, for doing that as well. Napatsi is an Inuit comic artist, fiction, nonfiction, and children's literature writer from Iqaluit, who now lives in Vancouver, where she attends UBC to complete an MFA in the creative writing program. She's also a contributing editor for Inuit Art Quarterly, where her comics will be featured as a limited series in 2020. And actually, I believe the first of the series, named Inuit Art Icons and Comics, was published just yesterday, as well as another comic named Momics that was published this week as well in Long Con magazine. Napatsi's written work has appeared in Walrus magazine, Pruton magazine, Matrix magazine, Tattle Creek, Town Crier, and Word Horde. Napatsi's first book, Joy of Apex, was published by Inhabit Media in 2011, and we're so happy to have you here with us, Napatsi. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have so many people here, and many of you are young people, so that's really nice because comics are for everyone.
I might just interject before we get started. If everybody wants to go and find Napatsi's square video and press on the 3 dots that appear in her video screen and pin her video, that means we will all be able to see Napatsi when she is talking. So if you want to go ahead and do that, it'll be easier for everybody. Go ahead.
All right, I'm gonna share the screen, my screen, so it'll probably be not so much me, but the images that I'm sharing, because I'll be showing you stuff and talking about it. I'll open up with, can everybody see that?
Yeah.
So this is a comic that I have permission to share from my niece, Inuit Futures, that she made for me after she saw a bunch of my comics that I was publishing and sharing with my family. And it's just an example. I wanted to show that comics can be made by anybody of any age. And that's one of the things I love most about them. So she's only 5, so it's hard to read it. But this comic, I'll read what they sent me. Onwin and Auntie Nap saw a raccoon at the riverside. The raccoon was playful. Onwin and Auntie Nap saw a dog. The dog wanted to play. Onwin and Auntie Nap fed the dog. The dog ate it up fast. Onwin and Auntie thought they should keep the dog, so they did. Onwin and Auntie were very pleased. So what I love about this is that anybody can make comics and share what they're thinking with the people that they care about. So this was very personal for me, but it also showed some creativity in the way you can tell a story. Like, she wrote words in one panel and then drew images in the other. So that's a great way to, oh, is everyone still there?
Yeah, we're here.
Oh, okay, sorry. What I've always been drawn to comics as long as, since I was a little kid. Here's an example of a comic that I actually read when I was a kid, because I grew up in Iqaluit and went to school in Inuit Futures. But then when I was 8 years old, I moved to Vancouver and I didn't know how to read in English. So I was behind a lot of my classmates in school. So my dad would get me comics and I would look through them without being able to read them. So I've whited out the actual speech bubbles in this just to show you how much you can actually read a story without any words in it. So it's great. This one does have words, but you can still tell what's going on in the story without the speech bubbles. A lot of this talk will be based on comics theory that I've read through Scott McCloud. He's a comic artist and a theorist about comics. And his definition of comics is juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. So what he's saying basically there, because that's a lot of technical languages, is what comics is just pictures next to each other that are put together in a certain way to tell a story.
Napatsi, sorry to bother you. Are we supposed to see an enlarged picture? Because we just see your basically a bunch of smaller pictures on the screen.
Sorry, here.
That's okay. Yeah, and then if you click on it, do we get to see it enlarged?
Can you see it?
We see it, but still as a thumbnail.
Oh. Sorry about that. Let's see. Okay. Open with photos. Is it still a thumbnail?
Yeah, it's still a thumbnail.
How about now?
Nope.
And Napatsi, you may have to go back into the sharing and share from where the photos actually are. Right now, you're sharing your file server.
Oh, okay.
So you'll need to go to where whatever application has the photos open in it.
Okay.
Under sharing the screen. Like if you're gonna share them from a program or something, to go to that program.
Okay.
There we go. And then if you open that one, there
Perfect.
That work?
That works. Thank you. Sorry, Napatsi.
No problem. Thank you. Right. I was talking about the comics, what comics is to Scott McCloud. So, right. I've already talked about how your age doesn't really matter when you're talking about comics. A lot of people think about comics as, you know, action type adventure comics or silly newspaper comics, but there's actually a huge range of things you can express through comics. That's one of the things I love about it. I am a writer, but I fell in love with making comics only in the last few years. So I've always been a storyteller, and what's so unique about comic making is you can tell any kind of story using images and words. It's a unique way to put a story into the world to give access to people who might not necessarily be interested in reading a book or a poem. Mm-hmm. So that's the nice thing too, is that you don't always have to have words in your comics. Oops, sorry, my mouse isn't working here. Like this example is a great example of a wordless page in a comic. The comic itself has words in it, but there's 2 whole pages here that just express what's going on in this character's world without using any words at all. And that's one of the beautiful things about it.
Yeah, it's very lovely, this image actually, Napatsi.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of understand exactly kind of what's going on in that moment just from these pieces put together, puzzle-like, right?
Yeah, and it's beautiful. Like, it gives a very strong sense of emotion without using any words.
Exactly, yeah.
So there's a lot. Okay, so comics theory is a big, broad thing, and we're not going to be able to cover it all in 1 hour. But I do want to talk about some important aspects of comics today. So in pictures, meaning is fluid and variable according to appearance. pictures differ from real life appearance in varying degrees. And oh, so this is my comic. I wanted to do an experimental silent comic that didn't require words, and to see what I could do to make that happen. So this was a memory of mine that I always loved when I was growing up as a kid, before I could read, was playing in the blackberry brambles, and how it felt to be in the warm summer days of my youth, to crawl through the brambles and, you know, get scratched, but to pick the sweet berries and enjoy that time just playing in the woods.
It's a great comic, Napatsi. It's funny because with the only, you know, like the title itself, you and the visual, you understand everything. It like comes together like a pretty package, right? Like the bow on top.
Yeah, and that's, I hadn't actually thought about titles, but that is sometimes an important aspect of what you're trying to do, is, especially if you're doing a wordless comic, is what your title says will lead the reader into a kind of theme of what you're trying to express in your story. So here the title is Worth It, and you might not necessarily get that sense from each panel without a title. Right. Sorry, my cards are out of order here. This is just a sample of faces that I practice. One of the things that I learned very quickly when learning to make comics is I'm not a very skilled artist in terms of technical drawing. So as you saw in my last image, I do stick people, and I deviate from that sometimes, but my primary comics are very stylized stick people. And the way that I do my best expression in comics is at looking at faces. So here you see just a couple of different faces, because depending on what you want to tell in a story, the best way to express emotion is through facial expressions. So here we have like raised eye. Can you see my mouse moving?
Yep.
So you see raised eyebrows and cheeks with someone smiling, or the eye.
The eye wrinkle.
Yeah. So when you're not specifically drawing a comic, the best way to practice is to either watch TV or watch your family or take selfies and look at the expressions people are making that you want to show on your page, and just practice them. Either if you're a good drawer and you have lots of detail, you can practice that. But if you're doing stick figures or simple figures like mine, you want to look at the most noticeable features on the face. So eyebrows are a really good feature, and mouths and cheeks are a great feature. I often don't have noses on my characters. None of these guys have them, but mostly my characters have no nose like this. And I was having a discussion with another comic artist the other day, because I posted a comic about allergies. And she said that she really noticed the importance of smell in my comic, because I included a nose in the character, and the nose was sniffing pollen. And because she was familiar with my work and my characters don't usually have noses, that sense of smell in the comic was heightened just by the presence of a nose. So it's really interesting once you start thinking about comics more seriously, the little things like that you notice. So expression is really great. And on top of facial expressions, even though I only draw stick people, sorry, not this one. I often go to the internet to look at people in positions that I want to draw. So in one of my comics, oh, there it is. I was looking for, I was drawing a baseball field. Oh, it's not this one. Sorry, I don't have that one up. And they're playing a game of baseball, and I couldn't figure out how to draw the stick people in the position that I wanted them. So I asked my husband to stand like he was holding a baseball bat, and he obliged, but you know, it took a little while. So he's like, when can I stop? So it's always good to go just Google images. You can Google, you know, baseball player or whatever you're drawing. And I find a lot of help on just Google image search for anything that I'm trying to draw.
So it's kind of a bit of like live model drawing for artists as well. You're just doing it from another angle.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is this isn't about being like a true artist. I mean, a lot of you might be or might become that. And I think that comic art is a great art form. But for the purposes of this workshop, I'm trying to talk about how to do it with what you have. And that's the easiest. We're lucky in the sense that we are able to just Google, you know, ballet dancer and have that there for us without needing a bunch of special, you know, artist tools or have to go see people who are modeling for that kind of thing. So along those lines, because I was talking about my stick people, this is one of the images from Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art. I will show you this book after if you're more serious about comic making and want to learn more about it. He talks about icons, and which is a fancy word for, you know, images and representations of things. So here he's talking about different styles of drawing, and he goes from the most realistic, which is a photo, to slightly more, and then progresses along to a cartoon. And the interesting thing he's talking about here is the more realistic an image looks, the more the reader will see it as somebody else rather than themselves. So the nice thing about having really cartoony images in your comics is that people will relate to them more. The more they don't look like a specific person, the more a person will see them in that character, themselves in that character.
Right, they become more relatable because you can kind of project yourself into that person.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic. Napatsi, do you think you could put the volume up a little bit on your end? I think there's a few people who are having a hard time with the volume. It's fine for me, but I think there are a couple people who are having volume. So if you could speak a bit louder or put the volume up a bit higher, I think that would be great.
Sure.
Thank
Sorry.
you. But I like that. I like what you said there. Right? That rings very true, right? We kind of, if we see the representation of someone who isn't at all or has characteristics that are not at all like ourselves, then we automatically assume it's not relatable to us. But then as soon as they become a bit more simplistic in some ways, we can kind of we can kind of crush ourselves onto that person or that character, I mean, no matter where their adventure takes them.
Mm-hmm. Is my volume going up now?
Oh yeah. Fantastic.
Is it too loud?
Too loud a little bit. Yeah. There we go. Let's stop there.
This is good?
Amazing.
Okay.
Thanks, Napatsi.
No problem. Yeah, so as I said earlier, in pictures, meaning is fluid and variable according to appearance. So here, it really depends on what kind of comics you want to make. For example, if you're doing a fictional comic about a specific character that's going on a journey, you might want to do it a little bit more realistic. It could be fantastic, it could be a fairy or a monster or something, but you might want to specify more that that character is their own self rather than trying to identify universally to your reader. I happen to not be great at realistic art, so whether I want the reader to be connecting to my characters or not, they might be doing so because all my people are stick people, but and that's the great thing too, is one of the other things I love about comics is they demand so much participation from the reader. So when you're making a comic, and I'm going to get into more details about panels and the space between panels, but the reader is making up a lot of the story themselves. So it's a great engagement with your reader, a lot more than, say, a movie or a book where the story is being told just by the narrator, or yeah, that. So I want to talk about closure, which is it's a fancy way of talking about how we perceive the world. So it happens everywhere in life, but it's also a major thing for comics. I have this meme here that I actually came upon yesterday. So this is actually a black and white picture. And what's happening is there's colored grid lines in different parts of the image, and your brain is filling in the rest outside of those color grid lines to make you see the picture as a color picture.
Wow.
Which is incredible. It's an incredible aspect of the human brain. But this relates to closure in terms of comics because I want to talk about, oops, here we go, closure. The act of observing the parts but perceiving the whole. Closure is the agent of change, time, and motion in comics. It's the primary means of simulating time and motion. So comics are interesting because they're static images. You have one picture that never changes and next to it another picture, and yet somehow you're able to show motion and time changing, and that's a very tricky thing to do in comics. So here's another Scott McCloud image that says, comic panels fracture both time and space, offering a jagged staccato rhythm of unconnected moments. Closure allows us to connect these moments and mentally construct a continuous unifying reality. So it's a lot like a movie, which you have pictures moving fast enough so that it looks like motion is happening. That's how movies work. But for comics, you have to do that without that speed and movement, and you create your own sense of movement. So what's happened, closure in this sense is we see this person and they look like they're walking, and then our brain makes the leap to see that they've stopped walking here and are bowing. Closure is really important when you're thinking about how your comic's going to come together, because you have to make the choices of the moment that you're going to draw in each panel. Like, you can have a really boring comic if you choose to do every little movement of a character, but that can also draw out emotion or feelings of boredom if you want to drop that out in a panel. Here.
Napatsi, we have a question.
Yes?
It's about, it's from Riley about text to image. And I don't know, maybe you'll get to it later about,
Go ahead, ask it.
but Riley would like to know about the relation of text to image. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about knowing how much text to include and how much to leave up to the image to tell or insinuate. Like, how do you know? You were talking earlier about like that one comic you showed us where there was no text at all. The one that you did, Worth It, there was just the title that worked, which I thought was really kind of like spot on, worked really well. How do you make that distinction? Like, how do you know when to add text and how much to add and how much to leave up to the image itself?
That's a great question. So there's several things going on when you're thinking about text to image. Is, as you saw in the one with no text, that was a very emotionally driven comic. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to portray a sense of feeling where text wouldn't necessarily be important because there's no other character to talk to, and the feeling was encapsulated by the world, like the natural world around the character.
Right.
So when you're thinking about text, you don't want to put too much text into a panel. There's different ways to incorporate text. Like this panel here is giving us information. And so it's good to have like longer pieces of information that you want to convey as like a top of the panel kind of statement. And the other issue is often that you have very little space in a panel, depending on what you're drawing. Like some panels take up a whole page, but the benefit of using a whole page for a panel is you usually want to do a expansive image in a large panel like that. So you don't want it to be taken up with a lot of text.
Right.
So when deciding on how much text you want to use, for me, words are very, very important parts of comics, but that makes the words even more important than if you were, say, writing a short story, because you have to decide what the important information you can't actually convey in images is, and then you can put that into text.
Right.
So let me just see if I have an example of that. So here, I'll just make this a little bit bigger. This is my comic, and I was telling a story about myself, about my life. And it's about the town I grew up in, which I wanted to show. So I have it here in this panel. But the information I wrote, you couldn't really express in images. So that's why I chose this caption. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. Like which you can't portray through the characters themselves or the image that you're giving. Well, then that has to be in text. And even then, I imagine you have to be quite specific about what text you use. Like you're not using tons of text. You have to be very kind of picky, I imagine, as well.
Yeah. And the thing too, when people are reading comics, is they don't want to be reading a novel. They want a comic to be readable. And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of comics that do have a lot of text. That's okay, but I find it unappealing when I open to a page and there's a lot of text cramming into the panels. Mm-hmm. So a good way to think about it when you're planning out your comic is, what do I want the story to say? What do I want the story to be about? Mm-hmm. And then to draft out your panels per page. Where's my draft? Here. So I knew a story that I wanted to tell, and this is a really crummy draft page, so that I knew where each piece of the story was going to be told before I started drawing it. So here's the draft. And then the final page of that is here. So you see, there's a lot of text on this page, but this was also that same story about my life that needed to be told in a lot of words. And the words tell a different story than just the images would. Like if you don't read this, you don't know what's going on.
Right.
So, but the images also give a better sense of emotion related to the words. It's depending on what story you want to tell, they have to bounce off of each other.
Mm-hmm.
So you never want to have your words telling the same story as your images.
Right, exactly. They have to be complementary, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Unless it's really funny or something. Like I drew a comic of this kid farting and I showed the fart and also they were talking about it in Inuit Futures.
I feel like that's an exception that can be made, right?
Yeah.
Comic relief, I feel like that exception.
Oh yeah. So does that answer the question, I hope? Okay, so back to closure. So closure is a really important thing to think about because that helps you think about what you're which images you're gonna choose for your panels. And that leads into the next topic, which is gutters. So gutters is just the comic term for the space in between panels. The space between panels where the reader's imagination takes separate images and creates a single idea. So here in this comic, it says, I followed my siblings around like a puppy, so I got to spend a lot of time with the older children. And then it says, it's my dad off screen saying, be nice to your sister. And that's me being smug and my brother and sister being unhappy that I had to follow them around. Why I chose this image when talking about gutters is because you can be really creative with gutters. Like people don't necessarily think about the blank spaces between their panels when they're reading comics. But here I really wanted to make this story about my hometown. So each page is a painting of the landscape of my hometown. And you see it in the background of the story being told about the town. So you can do a lot of things with gutters. Gutters are great because they engage your reader. They get to use their own imagination to see to connect the two panels connect the panels that are happening. The gutter creates the illusion of time and motion, but time can also be expressed in the same panel with speech bubbles or line of sight in the panel. We naturally look at time as a rope when we read comics. Oh yeah, rope. Here we go. So another thing people need to be thinking about when they're drawing comics is that there's a natural way that people read. Their eye follows a page. And it's usually in Western comics, not necessarily in Japanese manga or any of that kind of stuff, because a lot of Eastern artists read right to left. Mm-hmm. But for us, we tend to do left to right and then back to the bottom, left to right again.
Right.
So here's an example of how you can work creatively to lead your reader's line of sight. So this is not a traditional comic, and I just did it quickly, but you can follow the path of the feet that relates to the story but it also leads you in the way that you're supposed to be reading the comic.
It's a very funny comic, Napatsi.
Thank you.
Oh.
But yeah, you should be careful about how you draw panels, because it can be very confusing. They're important in terms of time and motion happening in your static images.
Mhm.
Here is an example. It's not confusing here, but if you, because there's different size panels. There's these, but they're all kind of linear. They're going in the same direction. But I have done panels that go long, like are longer, and they have 4 panels on this side. So what you're doing when you're deciding the size and shape of a panel is how much space and what emotion you want to express in that panel. So I have this one down here, which is a lot bigger than any of the other panels on the page. And I wanted it to express a sort of sense of the largeness of the city that I was in. I wanted to show Vancouver, to express that I was away from home, that I was in a different city, and so it's a larger piece there.
There's another question from a participant, Miali, wondering about the importance of the image to show the background, the landscape behind the pictures. And I don't know if that's in reference to the comic you showed earlier about you with your siblings.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like this. There's a background behind the gutters, right?
Yeah.
And is that supposed to be landscape? And is that like relative to the comic, like that specific comic itself? Could you just talk a bit about that maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So this one is specifically a landscape showing Apex, which is what this whole comic is about. So the comic is about my relationship to my hometown and how it made me feel and what it felt like when I left there. So each page, this is only one page, it's a 6-page comic.
Mhm.
Each page has a different image of the same town. It's like different skies, some of it's the ocean, there's a nighttime landscape. But I had done it this way to show that sort of expression of, this is a comic about this place, and all the panels will talk about it, but ultimately it's showing, like, the background is always, the theme of this comic is always sort of hanging in the background. You can always see it no matter which panel you're looking at.
In that sense, kind of the negative space that is the gutter, I guess, is always kind of active or ready to be activated in a way, you know, like as you're demonstrating with the other comic where with the dancing feet that go in the opposite direction. I mean, like that gutter space there is considered negative space or empty space, but in reality, it can kind of be transformed into a really important aspect of the story itself.
Yeah, because a lot of comics don't have a background in their gutters.
Mm-hmm.
It's just white. But if you, like, a good experiment is to draw a comic, anything you want, a simple comic, maybe three panels, and see what difference it makes if you just draw the comic without a space, but it's just like one rectangle with 2 lines in it. And then if you draw the same comic separated, it makes a huge difference. When I first started drawing comics, because I'm going to be honest, drawing panels is very annoying. Measuring them out and making sure that you don't, smudge your lines and stuff.
Right.
It's a bit of an annoying thing. So when I first started drawing, I would just kind of lazily do gutterless comics, and it really makes a difference having that space between your panels.
Yeah. That's very interesting. A good exercise for any comic drawers out there to do the exercise of with or without gutters.
Yeah. There's also, it's another interesting thing to think about gutters separating your images. So this was an experimental comic I did where the panels separate a single image. And why I chose to do that initially was because I was drawing this comic about seeing Unikaktua, the art circ show that was acrobatics and stuff, and it took up a huge space, and it was so beautiful, and I didn't want to shrink that image into a tiny panel like this. So what this is actually called I've only ever read this, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, polyptych, which is a moving figure or figures imposed over a continuous background. So it gives a sense of motion, even though you have your figure going into multiple panels, it's still all one background in all of those panels put together. So this is a stage, and it's two characters, but she's taking up two panels and he's taking up two panels. So that's a really interesting way to break up your images, is having just a small portion of the story you want to tell in one panel and it bleeding over into another panel.
Yeah, that's really exciting. It like creates a kind of grandeur and importance, right, for those characters who are in that position also.
Yeah. What do we have? 15 minutes, so I'm gonna skip a couple of things.
Well, Vicky has a question about comics and planning ahead, or
Okay.
like, Vicky has a question about planning ahead for a comic. Should you do a storyboard of sorts or a rough copy? I know you showed a draft earlier, like a rough draft. Is that kind of what you do, Napatsi? You do like a rough draft, or do you do like multiple drafts before you kind of end up with a final copy? Or what do you think about that with comics, planning ahead?
I think it's important. People do it in different ways. So there's comic scripts that you can do. You can find templates online anywhere. Just look for comic script. I don't usually do scripts because I just work better planning out my comic images. Here, let me pull that back up. So I will write down my story idea just roughly in notes. It really depends on your style. So you can do much more specific scripts, like saying each character's dialogue and your captions, and then draw out a draft. Like, I don't put a lot of fine detail effort into my drafts. I just do something really rough like this so that I know how much space each panel is going to take up, and I know where I want to put text. So here you can see is my text box, which is where it is in the final draft. And then I find this way helps me a lot with minimizing the amount of text that I'm using. So there's not a lot of space in these panels for text. So this is all text. This panel here is all text, but you want to balance it nicely. So I do a page of rough notes on what story I want to tell, and then I do a rough draft page like this of the whole comic, and then the final page of that one is here. I'll do the final, but when I'm working on my images, I'll often practice on just a separate page completely, like the face I want to draw, to make sure I get it right. And if I get it really well on my draft page, then you can even trace them. So
Okay.
like that first example I showed, I'll have a page of faces like this until I find the right one that I want to use for my final comic. And I have, I don't know, can you see my video or is it just my screen?
We can see your video too. If everyone's pinned you, we can see your face as well.
So I have a light pad, which, you know, unless you're going to be doing a lot of comics, you don't need to get. I got that for $50. But if you have like an iPad or something, you can just do a light up white page and easily trace your images if you have one that you're happy with. Do you have a question, Colton?
Oh, 1 second. Oh, hold on a second, Colton.
He might have just been waving.
He's muted, so. Colton, we're waiting for you to unmute yourself so we can hear your great question.
I don't have a question.
Oh.
Just waving.
It was the 7th inning stretch.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'll just talk about color quickly and then take some questions.
Great.
If there are more.
Oh, there are many more.
Color. Pardon?
There are many more questions.
Okay, good. So I've shown a bunch of these already, but I'll show this color one. So color can have a profound physical and emotional effect on people. Flat colors tend to emphasize the shape of objects and animate the inanimate. Colors objectify their subjects, making the reader more aware of the physical form. Color can express mood and depth. And in black and white, ideas are communicated more directly, where meaning transcends form. So it really depends on what you're interested in doing with your comic. If you're going to use color or use black and white. I love both color and black and white comics for very different reasons. This comic, for example, is beautiful, and the use of color really emphasizes the shapes and the sort of natural world around her, and draws our attention to what's happening in that world, rather than telling us a specific story. Like, what's the meaning of this is less clear because you get a broader sense of emotion from the color on the page. Color is also great to highlight, like on an otherwise black and white comic. Color's great to emphasize different things. Like, I often do black and white comics with just a little bit of color. Like this one, I chose to do watercolor for just the magical elements that I found from that show. So these were silk, hanging silk that the woman was using to do her acrobatics. And then I painted his outfit in brown just to show that this guy was on stilts. Like it emphasizes what of that show was magical to me. So he was a giant, and he was wearing a big giant suit. And then I also wanted to use color in this image, or in these images, because it was going to be something without words, and color really makes emotion pop a lot more easily when you're looking at images. And yeah, this was a primarily black and white comic I did, but it was about my dad's doodles. So I did those in color so that it would pop, because I remember very particularly loving his colorful drawings when I was a kid in his notebooks. So everything is in black and white except for that. Yeah. There was a bunch of other stuff that I was going to mention, but I'd rather answer some questions for you. And I just wanted to say one more thing before I answer questions is there's some examples that I have here of lines. Like, the great thing about comics is because you're only engaging someone visually, you can't express sound or smell or touch in any other way besides visually. So there's some great ways to do it in comics. You can make your speech bubbles look different and express like rage or fear or anxiety using different kind of interesting lines for your comic speech bubbles. And even like I express time in, I express the changing of time into the past in my other comic, which I can't get to for some reason. By using thought bubbles, like panel differences are a great way to express different ideas. Here, nope, this one. So with changing time in your comics, it's hard to do that without having a lot of text. So you can do it in creative ways. Like in this comic, I was thinking about what I wanted to get as a tattoo. So that's happening here. Like, this panel is supposed to be a Polaroid, and then these are regular time, me thinking about what I should get for my tattoo. And then I remember something in the past. So that's how I indicated a time change, is by making the whole panel my memory bubble. And you see me as a little kid here and here. So that's interesting ways to express time and emotion just using images. Shall we move on to questions?
We can, definitely. We have a question from Yali. How and where can we find your comics? And, other than the Inuit Art Quarterly and Long Con, where they've just been published this last week, so we know we can find them there. But are there any other places, Napatsi, that we can find your comics?
So far, I only have them on my Instagram, and there's not that many there because I'm new to Instagram. But you can follow me on Instagram, NAPNTC, NAP. Actually, I don't remember how to spell it. NAPNTISI, I believe, or I think you can just search my name. Okay. And that's where I post my comics mostly. Yeah.
It's very exciting, you being published as a comic strip artist this last week, and with this workshop happening in the same week. I think that's just amazing. But I wanted to ask you, what is it like to be published as a comic in Inuit Art Quarterly, where you've been a contributing editor for the last 2 years? How does that feel, and what is that? How does that? What's that like?
It was really exciting because I'd been doing comics before I started that job, and the staff are really fantastic. I love working with them, and they're really supportive. So my boss, Britt, had asked a couple times if I was interested in doing any kind of specific work, like not just editing the material for the magazine, but doing my own online either column or anything I was interested in. And she knows what I like to write about and that I like comics. So she asked if I would be interested in doing an online comic for the magazine, and I got really excited, and it made me think a lot more about, because my primary comics before this have always been quite autobiographical, about my own life. So it's really great to challenge myself and think about comics about artists and how to translate stories about people I don't know into comics so that people can enjoy that as well. So it's been really challenging but fun.
Yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the comic series that you're embarking on with Inuit Art Quarterly. I think it's called Inuit Art Icons and Comics. Is that correct?
Yes.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about it, like how many comics there'll be, who you're going to be. I mean, unless it's all top secret and we're not allowed to know, but maybe you can just share with us a little bit what that is.
It's not top secret. We're not, we don't have all of the comics lined up yet. But it's going to be a series of 9 comics so far, and each one covers a different artist. So this week, yesterday, the comic that came out was about Kinujuak Asiba.
Yep.
And the next one, which I have a draft of, is about Helen Kalvak from Western Arctic. And I think we have a list of others, but I'm not sure of all of them yet. I know that Palupudlat is one of them, just because it's my brother and sister's grandfather. So I wanted to do a little call out to him. But yeah, it's interesting because they're all going to be quite different, because I have different information about each of them available to me. So it's a challenge to not just do the same comic about different artists every time, but to have to come up with something unique and interesting that expresses that person's art is going to be really fun and hard to do.
Yeah, quite a challenge. But I think the one that I just saw from this week, it was great. It was fantastic. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Anybody else with any questions for Napatsi?
Linda?
Linda? Linda's just applauding.
Oh.
Oh my goodness, that's very funny. I was wondering also, there's a couple questions here about what subject matter do you feel like the comic strip allows you to explore more freely than, let's say, writing? Because I mean, you are a writer as well. So how do you navigate those two mediums, and like which one, how do comics come into it, and what subject matter do you feel like you can express yourself more freely in?
I think comics are great for comedy. I know there's lots of great writers who can tell good jokes and write good comedic writing. I'm not a comedy writer, but I find I can express my funnier side a lot more easily in images. Because so much of, and I don't know if it's not just Inuit, but Inuit specifically are very expressive, and their sense of humor is very much related to physical comedy. So I love that about comics, is that you can draw like a funny face or a weird position, and it will make the comic that much funnier, that much more likable. I also really love it for very emotional writing. The stuff that I've done in my comics classes has been quite dark, and I've been able to explore my own personal emotions in a way that I wouldn't be able to express through words necessarily. Like, because you can draw things like anxiety and fear without directly talking about them or saying like, I'm scared. You can express your feelings in pictures in a way that you might not be capable of doing so in words right away. Like, it's the last comic I did was about losing people, and it was really cathartic. It felt great to express myself in pictures and words, but mostly through the images. Some of the harder stuff that I was trying to express was in silent images, and it was really effective and strong and made me feel good. So I think it's great, especially for kids too, who don't necessarily know how to express their emotions either to themselves or to their parents. It's great to draw. Like, if you're really mad, you can just draw like a crazy angry page, and you'll know that that's angry without saying what happened or why. So it's a great medium for that, for expressing stuff that you don't necessarily understand yet.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And when I was thinking about this workshop today, I was thinking about the kind of comics that I grew up with and how they really did do that. There's some that were really kind of really dark and intense. If you think about, like, Batman and stuff like this, they're really like dark and intense and kind of almost really, yeah, almost not even for kids sometimes. And then there are ones that were just that you'd find in like the Sunday funnies that were kind of your everyday type actions or gestures, right? So
Yeah.
something that would happen in your everyday life, but just turning that into a kind of on paper, and the kind of everything that you laugh about in every day that maybe you don't think everybody else would find funny, but that you do,
Yeah.
So the ability to kind of go in every place and work with different kind of subject matter, which is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we have some more questions here about the comic classes. Are in university, online, or in your local community?
The classes that I've taken have been in university, but I know that there's a lot of online stuff available, especially now with everyone working from home. There's often Lunar Baboon, or I forget what he's called. The guy who does the like duck comics, Poultry or something. I follow them on Instagram. There's lots, if you want to do comics classes with actual sharing, because that's one thing I was sad about for this, was that I wasn't able to do like drawing lessons with people. Not lessons, but drawing examples and then being able to share it, because it's really hard to just be like, oh, hey, look what I drew online. But it's really fun to do that. Is like, whenever I took my classes, we would start out taking attendance by doing a selfie of ourselves, a self-portrait based on something that the professor gave us that day. So it's really fun to take classes, and you can find lots of online comics classes. And I even encourage you to just do it with your friends, or challenge each other to draw. Say, the last comic I did that was a self-portrait, actually I think I have it here, was draw yourself after 2 months of quarantine and what kind of haircut you would have.
Was this before it had been 2 months of quarantine?
Yeah, it was like 2 weeks into it, and it was really funny because we all got to see, like, this one's, can you see my guy here?
That's fantastic.
So just anything like that you can think of to do it with people who are interested in comics, or with your friends at school. Just challenge each other with funny little things like that. But yeah, there's stuff online, and if you're interested in planning on going to university, you can always take a comics course, like first year or second year.
There's Miele wants to know, or says that they find putting written stuff out there to be intimidating. How do you put yourself out there and trust it'll be okay?
I think it's hard to get used to it. But just to remember, like, if you're ever feeling self-conscious, just look at my comics. They're stick people. And they've been published. So it's just having the confidence to let it happen. And also a really important thing to remember is that even the most accomplished writers and artists get rejected all the time. So if you do decide to put yourself out there and get rejected, it's not because you're bad. It's because not necessarily because you're bad, but sometimes the place that you're submitting to just doesn't like that style, or they have too much stuff coming in. There's lots of reasons, and even professionals get rejected constantly. So
I think that's some great advice, and a great place, I think, to leave it. I don't know if any of our participants today had been drawing or making comics while the workshop was going on, but if you were, I'd welcome you guys to come and show us what you drew.
yeah, I'd love to see them.
Anybody? Show us, everybody. Yay. Oh, great. So Colton has something.
Ooh,
Great. Hey, Fred, you want to show Fred?
nice.
Freddie has something. Who else has something?
Oh, those look great.
Anybody else? Well, we definitely have some future comic strip artists in the gang. So congratulations. Oh, and Nolan does too. Great job, Nolan.
Cool.
Oh, great. That's fantastic. Sarah, Nolan, that's beautiful. Fantastic. Great guys. Well, I want to just say thank you to everybody for being here. And thank you to you, Napatsi, for spending some time with us today and really taking us through your process and how you work. It's been really fun and enlightening for all of us, I'm sure, and given us a bit more confidence to go out there and show our work to the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
It's great to talk to everyone. Great questions.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.